In the comments of some of my videos talking about the class balance of D&D, link in the description if you want to check those out, there's a fairly familiar sentiment that I've seen pop up from time to time which basically suggests the idea that ultimately the class balance doesn't really matter in a game like D&D. The game is primarily a cooperative experience after all. The game isn't built around player versus player combat, so ultimately how balanced the classes are with each other just doesn't actually matter. And to be fair, this idea is far from unique to my videos. I often see this kind of sentiment brought up in discussions about just single-player games in general. If there's no other players around, then balance ultimately doesn't actually matter there either, right? And I have to say that I greatly object to this idea. Balance is an important aspect in all forms of games, whether they're competitive, cooperative, or even single-player. Balance is just a key part of game design as a whole. So let's talk about why that is. Now, for one, I think we should first acknowledge the fact that a game's balance is not a simple binary state. A game is not simply either balanced or unbalanced. Balance is more of a sliding scale that ranges from absolute chaos to perfect balance, and in fact, arguably, very few games can be said to actually achieve that perfect balance at all. Take chess, for example. Both players have all the exact same pieces and even have all of the same information available at all times, so it seems like a perfectly balanced game at first glance. However, the fact that white has the first move means that they actually have a very slight advantage in tempo over black. Ultimately, this only really matters at the highest levels of play, but it is an advantage nonetheless that causes the game to not quite be perfectly balanced. And for the record, in game design, I believe that this is called first move advantage and is a pretty common problem in most turn-based games like this. But obviously, if we take things a step further and say give one side of the board an entire extra piece to start with, well then that would clearly be even less balanced than the normal game. So it's pretty easy to demonstrate that the concept of balance in a game is kind of a spectrum. That's why PvP games like League of Legends or Street Fighter receive regular updates and patches to try and bring the game closer to this theoretical, if unobtainable, perfect balance. So with that in mind, I will fully acknowledge the idea that balance is less important in a cooperative game than a player versus player one. In virtually any PvP experience, you want the game's balance to be as close to perfect as possible in almost all instances. But in a co-op experience, you do have a little more wiggle room to work with, as you don't necessarily need to aim for that ideal, perfect balance state. And furthermore, in a single-player experience, that wiggle room is probably even wider. But to say that balance doesn't matter or to dismiss all discussions of balance completely in such games, that's just fundamentally absurd to me. After all, we can simply take this idea to its logical extreme to show why balance obviously matters to at least some degree. Take a game like Monster Hunter, for example. There's a variety of different weapons you can use, and they are by no means perfectly balanced with each other. I mean, you can simply look at the differences in various speedrun times for each weapon category, and clearly some weapons are better at killing monsters faster than others. But now, let's imagine that we got a new weapon added to that game, and that weapon does more damage than a greatsword while attacking faster than a pair of dual blades. It even gives you super armor constantly so that monsters can't actually interrupt your attacks, and every hit has lifesteal so you can't die. Would such a weapon be considered good design? I mean, it's obviously blatantly overpowered, but by the logic of this mindset, balance doesn't matter, right? Sure, maybe the counter-argument is that you don't have to use the weapon. It's still your choice to trivialize the game with it or to play with a more reasonable weapon instead. But again, think of the cooperative environment. Even if you actively choose not to use the overpowered weapon, someone else you play with might, and them using that weapon can still trivialize the fight for you, actively ruining your fun because their weapon is overpowered. Now, sure, obviously this is a very extreme example, but I think that it still proves the overall point that balance has to matter at least a little bit in these kinds of games. Like I said, it doesn't need to be perfect. Balance isn't as important in a co-op environment as compared to a PvP one, but it still clearly matters to at least some degree. This is why I talk about it so much in games like D&D. In an ideal world, every player at the table should be having fun and contributing to each encounter in roughly equal amounts in some meaningful way. play. It's not exactly fun or engaging to just be the dead weight being dragged along while someone else gets to do all the cool stuff without you. If every fight is over in 1 or 2 turns because the wizard cast a really big spell that killed everyone or otherwise hindered all the enemies to the point that nobody else even got to do anything, then that's not only bad balance, but it actively harms the amount of fun that everyone else can have. Plus, this kind of issue can often result in certain classes just not being played compared to everyone else. Famously, classes like the Ranger and Monk have a ton of balance issues in the current version of D&D that render a lot of their abilities mostly useless in a lot of circumstances. And as a direct result of that, they often end up being played the least according to many polls on the subject. And like, as a game developer, that just means that at some point you're just wasting resources if nobody's going to use them. Ideally, if you're making literally any kind of content for your game, you want people to play with it. So if you make it super underpowered compared to everything else, then naturally people are just going to not use that weapon or class or whatever it is, and you just wasted a ton of development time and resources making something that nobody wants to play with. And that concept ties directly into why balance matters even in single player games as well. Now, like I said, I'm not trying to argue that it's as important as it is in multiplayer games. For example, there are a number of contexts where purposefully unbalancing things is fine, if not ideal. Take the starting classes in Elden Ring, for example. They definitely don't need to be perfectly balanced against one another, because they're mostly more for just helping you start out playing whatever archetype that you want to play. As long as the sorcerer gives me a staff and some spells to start with, I'm fine whether it's stronger or weaker or average. And of course, you then have the Wretched class, which is very purposefully designed to start out weaker than every other class, because for one, it's designed for more experienced players who might want more of a challenge at the start of the game, so it sort of acts as a kind of difficulty option. But it also gives those experienced players the most freedom to control their build. Not to mention other similar concepts, like how weapons you find at the beginning of the game probably shouldn't be equally as strong as weapons you find at the end of the game. I mean, that's literally just the concept of progression, so it makes sense that not every weapon would be equally as viable. But by that same measure, it seems pretty obvious that there are ways that this balance could be ruined, right? Like, what if you put the most powerful weapons in the game at the start? That would cause the player to not only steamroll all the enemies in the first few areas, but would also render the rest of the loot in the game pointless. Like, if you're gonna give the player overpowered weapons right away, then for example, any side quest that rewards the player with a weaker sword than what they already have becomes pointless. So nobody will do any of the side content, and that means that the developers are now wasting their time and money making all of that content, all because the sword at the start of the game had a number that was too high. Now, there are a few natural arguments that I'd expect to see in response to this, like, well, nobody's forcing you to use the overpowered sword, just use the weaker one instead to fix the game, and like, yeah, some players will purposefully challenge themselves like that, but I feel like the player shouldn't be the one responsible for fixing the game's balance, and either way, that kind of argument is still a tacit admission that the game is poorly balanced to begin with, because it still acknowledges that the player needs to actively avoid using the overpowered weapon to avoid ruining the game experience for them. So even if you do avoid using it, it's still clearly a problem that exists in the game. Especially since this specific example is obviously taken to a rather extreme hyperbole. More often than not, this issue is a lot more subtle, and a lot of players don't even realize that they're falling into this overpowered meta. I think that one of the best examples of this is, of course, Skyrim and the quote-unquote stealth archer strategy. Like, I know it's a meme, but it's also a very real phenomenon that if you have played Skyrim, you have probably ended up playing some variation of the stealth archer build. There's a lot of individual small reasons for it, but the practical upshot is basically that melee is impractical and uninteresting to play, and spells require a lot more skill points and mana management. Meanwhile, archery is really easy to play, super powerful, and when combined with stealth, essentially lets you negate entire encounters effortlessly at almost zero risk to your own health bar. This is fundamentally an issue of game balance, and actually, this is a known phenomenon in game design known known as dominant strategies. Essentially, in the same way that electricity likes to take the path of least resistance, players will ultimately tend to do whatever provides the most reward for the least amount of effort. Again, sure, some people will purposefully try to limit themselves in some ways to make the game harder, but most people just don't play games that way, especially when they're going into a game for the first time blind. And as a result, when you have these kinds of balance issues, you can cause people to play the game in a way that might result in a less enjoyable experience. Like, if the game unintentionally guides the player into using a strategy or weapon or whatever that trivializes the content and makes the game less enjoyable, especially if the player doesn't even realize that this is happening, then that's just bad design and a perfect example of why balance matters even in the single player context. And of course, this goes both ways as well. If the player, let's say, wants to play a class in an RPG, but that class is not very well fleshed out and is super underpowered, then the game ends up being way harder than it should be, and that's just as bad of a problem. Like I said at the start, balance is not a black and white binary, and I will concede that not every game necessarily needs to try and be as perfectly balanced as possible. But whether you're talking about a highly competitive esport, a casual cooperative experience, or even a single-player game in general, balance is still an important consideration in game design no matter what kind of game you're making. But, as always, I am happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. What's your take on this discussion? Do you think I have a point that there are still reasons to think about a game's balance even in co-op and single-player environments? Or do you think that all sense of balance may as well be thrown out the window as long as the game isn't a competitive PvP experience? And if you liked what you saw, remember to leave me a like. If you want to see me make more videos like this, then make sure to hit the subscribe and ring the bell so that you can get notified of when I make more videos in the future. And if you want to really help the channel out, then you can become a member on YouTube or donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.